Jack McCarty had never been much of a gambler. He'd grown up believing that a man's work and his word were worth more than any lucky card could promise. But on that cold March evening in Redstone, Montana, the old rancher found himself pushing open the creaky door to the Copper Saloon, a place he'd visited only a handful of times in the past year. The wind outside was sharp, cutting through his denim jacket, and the warmth of the dimly lit room wrapped around him like a warm blanket. He smelled the familiar blend of cigarette smoke, whiskey, and fried food. He had come to town for supplies, a feed for the cattle, oil for the tractor, and maybe a new pair of gloves, but he wasn't quite ready to head back to the empty ranch. Nights were the worst. Since his wife, Mary Ann, had passed away 2 years earlier, the silence at home felt heavier than the Montana snow. No clinking of dishes, no hum of her singing while she cooked, no voice to greet him at the door. Just the sound of the wind rattling the windows and the creak of the old house settling. Jack found a seat at the far end of the poker table, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, his weathered hat tipped low. The game was already underway. Around the table sat familiar faces: Earl, the grumpy feed store owner; Dale, who ran the gas station; and a few ranch hands from neighboring spreads. But there was one man Jack didn't recognize, a wiry fellow with slicked back hair and a restless look in his eyes. He wore a black leather jacket and tapped his fingers on the table between plays. The others called him Cole. The dealer slid Jack a hand, and he tossed in a few dollars. He wasn't there to win big, just to pass the time. As the night wore on, the pile of chips in front of Cole began to shrink. He laughed it off at first, shrugging and joking about bad luck, but there was something desperate in his smile. It was close to midnight when the air in the room seemed to shift. Cole had lost nearly everything. With a sharp glance around the table, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a battered envelope. He tossed it onto the pile of chips like it was nothing. "What's that?" Earl asked, his brow furrowing. Cole smirked. "Guardianship papers," he said. "For my niece." The room went still. Even the jukebox in the corner seemed quieter. "Guardianship?" Dale asked slowly. "You mean a broken bar you're betting a person?" Cole shrugged. "She's 17. I took her in after my sister died, but she's more trouble than she's worth. Eats like a horse, mouths off, never listens. You win this hand, she's yours. Free and clear." Jack felt his stomach twist. The thought of a young girl being treated like a poker chip didn't sit right. He could have stood up, walked away, and left Cole to his mess, but something in him wouldn't let it go. He didn't know this girl, didn't know her story, but he knew what it was to be unwanted. His own father had been the kind of man who treated affection like a reward you had to earn, and Jack had spent most of his boyhood working for scraps of approval that never came. The dealer looked uneasy. "That's not exactly a normal stake, Cole." Cole leaned forward, voice low. "It's legal. Got the papers right here. Just needs a signature. You all know me, I'm a man of my word." Jack's eyes flicked to the envelope. He could see a few sheets of paper inside, folded neatly. The others at the table shifted uncomfortably, but no one called him out. It was obvious they didn't want any part of it. Jack cleared his throat. "What happens if no one takes your bet?" Cole grinned. "Then I guess I keep her. But between you and me, old man, you look like the kind who could use some company out on that lonely ranch." The words were meant as a jab, but Jack didn't try to it. He thought of the empty kitchen table, the barn with only cattle for company, the long nights staring at the flickering light of the television just to drown out the silence. He thought about Mary Ann, about how they had tried for years to have children, about how the doctors had finally said it wasn't possible. They'd considered adoption once, but life on a ranch was hard, money was tight, and Mary Ann's health had begun to fail. By the time she passed, the dream of raising a child had died with her. Jack looked down at his cards. A pair of queens. Not a bad hand, but not unbeatable. He met Cole's gaze. "I'm in." The table erupted in murmurs. Earl muttered something about Jack losing his mind, but the dealer dealt the next round. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Cole's smirk never wavered. The final card hit the table. Jack's heart pounded. He looked at his hand, a three of a kind. Cole threw his cards down with a flourish, revealing two pair. For a moment, the room was silent. Then the dealer spoke. "Winner A. Jack McCarty." Cole's smirk faltered. He forced a laugh, reached for the envelope, and shoved it across the table. "Guess she's yours now." Jack picked it up, the weight of what had just happened settling heavy in his chest. He hadn't wanted to win. Not like this. The rest of the game dissolved quickly after that. Players drifted toward the bar or out into the night, leaving Jack and Cole standing by the door. "She'll be at your place tomorrow morning," Cole said flatly. "Truck'll drop her off. She's got a suitcase. That's all." Without another word, he stepped into the cold and disappeared into the dark. Jack drove home in silence. The headlights carved a narrow path through the snow, and the wipers scraped against the windshield. He set the envelope on the passenger seat, glancing at it now and then as if it might vanish. When he got home, he made himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The papers were relay guardianship signed by Cole and notarized, with the name Emily Ross typed neatly across the top. She was indeed 17. Her mother had passed away 4 years earlier, and her father was listed as unknown. Jack rubbed his face. He didn't know the first thing about raising a teenage girl. He'd spent his life working with cattle, fixing fences, and baling hay. His conversations with women her age had been limited to the occasional small talk at the grocery store. But tomorrow, Emily Ross would be standing on his porch, expecting a broken bar. What, exactly? The next morning dawned gray and cold. Jack was in the barn feeding the horses when he heard the sound of tires crunching on the driveway. He stepped outside, wiping his hands on the rag. A faded blue pickup rolled to a stop. The passenger door opened, and a thin girl stepped out, her hair a tangled mess, her jeans torn at the knees. She carried a single, battered suitcase held together with duct tape. She didn't look at him right away. Her eyes stayed on the ground as she spoke. "I'm Emily. Guess you're my broken bar new owner?" Jack's chest tightened at the word. "No, ma'am," he said quietly, meeting her gaze. "If you're gonna stay here, your family." For the first time, she looked him in the eyes, and though her expression was guarded, there was the faintest flicker of something else. Not trust, not yet. But maybe broken bar hope. Jack carried Emily's suitcase into the ranch house, setting it down in the small guest room at the end of the hallway. The room had been empty for years, but Marianne had always kept it tidy, just in case visitors came by. The quilt on the bed was one she had made herself, a blue and gold squares stitched together with careful hands. Jack wasn't sure if Emily would like it, but he figured it was warmer than the thin blanket she'd been carrying. "You can make yourself at home," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "There's a dresser there, closet's empty. Bathroom's down the hall." Emily didn't answer. She stepped past him into the room, set her suitcase on the bed, and began unzipping it. The contents were sparse: a couple pairs of jeans, 2 worn t-shirts, a hoodie, and a pair of sneakers with fraying laces. At the bottom was a folded photo, edges bent from handling. Jack caught a glimpse of a smiling woman holding a much younger Emily. He didn't ask questions. He spent the rest of the day tending to chores, giving her space. She didn't join him for lunch, and at dinner she only picked at the stew he'd made before mumbling a quiet thanks and retreating to her room. Jack didn't take it personally. Trust wasn't something that came overnight. Over the next week, a rhythm began to form. Emily kept to herself, spending most of her time in the barn loft or wandering the fields with her hands stuffed in her hoodie pockets. Jack made sure there was food on the table and clean clothes in the laundry, but he didn't push her to talk. He knew the value of silence, and he knew that sometimes, people needed time to feel safe before they could open up. One morning, after light snow had dusted the ground, Jack found her in the barn brushing one of the horses. She didn't notice him at first. Her movements were slow, almost careful, as if she was afraid the animal might startle. "She likes you," Jack said, leaning against the doorway. Emily glanced over her shoulder. "She's calmer than most people I've met." There was no bitterness in her tone, just a quiet statement of fact. Jack stepped closer. "Horses can be that way. They listen more than they talk." That was the start of something. Slowly, Emily began spending more time outside with him, helping with the morning feed, watching as he mended fences, learning how to scatter hay for the cattle. She was a quick learner, though she pretended not to care. Whenever he praised her work, she would shrug and look away, but he caught the faintest flicker of pride in her eyes. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of fence along the south pasture, Jack finally asked the question that had been on his mind since the night they met. "Emily, do you want to be here? I mean a broken bar. If you'd rather go somewhere else, I won't stop you. I just want you to have a choice." She tightened the wire on the fence post before answering. "Cole wasn't exactly a broken bar great guy to live with. I don't have anywhere else to go. So I guess this is fine." "Fine." It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Jack nodded, letting the subject drop. As the weeks turned into months, the walls between them began to lower. Emily started eating meals with him, even helping to cook now and then. She had a sarcastic sense of humor that caught him off guard, and sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, she smiled. Jack found himself looking forward to those moments more than he'd expected. But it wasn't all easy. Emily had a stubborn streak, and there were days when she'd disappear for hours without telling him where she was going. One evening, after she came back long after dark, Jack was waiting on the porch. "You worried me," he said simply. She rolled her eyes. "I'm fine. I can take care of myself." "I don't doubt that," Jack replied, "but when you're out here, someone needs to know where you are. That's not about control, that's about making sure you're safe." She muttered something under her breath and went inside. The next day, she told him before leaving to walk into town. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The turning point came during the late spring storm. The sky had been dark all afternoon, but by evening, the wind was howling across the plains and rain was hammering the roof. Jack was in the barn making sure the animals were sheltered when he heard the creak of the door. Emily stood there, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face. "Power's out," she said, shivering. "Come on," Jack told her, grabbing a lantern. They ran back to the house through the sheets of rain. Inside, he lit the lantern and set it on the table, the warm glow casting soft shadows on the walls. He handed her a towel and poured her a cup of hot cocoa. They sat by the fire, listening to the wind rattle the windows. After a long silence, Emily spoke. "You know, Cole used to leave me alone for days sometimes. No food, no phone, nothing. I'd just a broken bar wait until he came back." Jack's grip on his mug tightened. "I'm sorry you went through that." She stared into the flames. "Your broken bar different. You don't ask for anything back." "That's not true," Jack said gently. "I'm asking for something right now." She glanced at him, puzzled. "I'm asking you to let me be here for you. Not as your owner. A broken bar may be the closest thing to a father you've got." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then her eyes glistened, and she whispered, "No one's ever said that to me before." From that night on, something shifted. Emily started calling him Dad without hesitation. Jack, once haunted by the echo of an empty house, now woke to the sound of footsteps on the stairs and the smell of pancakes being made by a teenager who'd never cooked much before. The summer brought long days of work on the ranch. Emily learned to ride horseback, her laughter echoing across the fields. She helped with branding, mucking stalls, and even driving the old pickup into town. Jack taught her how to change a tire, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to balance a checkbook, all the little things he wished someone had taught him when he was her age. There were still rough days. Sometimes, memories of her past would creep in and she'd retreat into silence. Jack never pressed her to talk, but he always made sure she knew he was there. And over time, she began to believe it. By the first snowfall of the next winter, they had built something that looked and felt like a family. It wasn't perfect, and nothing ever was, but it was real. One evening, as they decorated a small Christmas tree in the living room, Emily stepped back to admire their work. "You know," she said softly, "if you hadn't played poker that night, we never would have met." Jack smiled. Funny how life works. Sometimes the worst bets turn out to be the best wins. She reached for an ornament shaped like a horse and hung it near the top. "I think a broken bar. I got lucky." Jack didn't answer right away. He just placed a hand on her shoulder and squeezed gently. "So did I, kiddo." The wind outside rattled the windows, but inside the little ranch house, it was warm. Not just from the fire, but from the quiet certainty that, against all odds, they had both found exactly what they needed. And for Jack McCarty, who had once believed he'd spend the rest of his days alone, that was more valuable than any hand of cards he'd ever played.